Greetings, my pleasant viewers. This is Wayne, and we have another video specifically pertaining to Ibas of Edessa, the case and the whole ecclesiastical history pertaining to Ibas of Edessa. You might have heard this name in polemical spaces online, or just reading history books, or you might have never heard of this name. We'll go into a full treatment of this. It'll be quite comprehensive and probably quite long, so feel free if you want to skip past all of the nitty-gritty bits just to the parts that you guys want to know about. And let's get started. So I think everyone who's well-oriented or familiar with this case is aware of the letter of Ibas to Mari, the Persian. Now, this letter was brought up against Ibas at a council in 449, the Council of Berytus, which is it is known as Beirut in Lebanon, modern-day Lebanon. And this letter was cited by the opponents of Ibas, or the accusers of Ibas, and it was also cited in the Robber Synod, or the second quote-unquote Ephesian Council. Now, I just want to read out a couple of quotes just to be quite clear about my position on this letter before we go into any more of this. So if you take a look at what Ibas is writing, he specifically says, "Then Cyril, as he desired to reject the words of Nestorius, was found to fall into the teaching of Apollinaris. For like him, Cyril wrote that God the Word became a human, so that there was no distinction between the temple and him who dwells in it. For he wrote 12 chapters with which think your godly piety is acquainted. There is one nature of divinity and of the humanity of our Lord Jesus Christ. One ought not, as he says, distinguish the expressions which either our Lord said about himself or the evangelists said about him." Now, you'll see these statements, right? I'm not going to read all of them out because they are quite long, but you can see he's accusing Cyril of being an Apollinarian, accusing him of not distinguishing the expressions, which is just false. Cyril multiple times did that. You can also see him accusing Cyril of being a tyrant and being uncanonical by starting the council early. You can also see that he's again calling Cyril's works, the 12 chapters, which were ostensibly ratified at Ephesus, to be not part of the true faith and of something that is heresy. And then at the end, he also does say that the Lord willed Cyril's heart, or subdued the Egyptian's heart, as he says, and that he renounced his previous teaching. So if we were to summarize that, it could be said that he accuses Cyril of falling into Apollinarianism, and that his 12 chapters are heresy since they deny the humanity of Christ and the sayings divided. He accuses Cyril of being deceptive and turn the Council of Ephesus into a false council and preach heresy and lies. He slanders his own bishop, Rabula of Edessa, for endorsing Cyril and attacking the Nestorian theology of Theodore of Mopsuestia. He praises Theodore of Mopsuestia, who was condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and even by anti-Chalcedonian polemics such as Philoxenus of Maberg, and also the Armenian churches, so the Armenian and Syriac churches within the early 6th century. He believes in the typical Nestorian interpretation of the Formula of Reunion, which is, of course, erroneous, which believes that Cyril retracted his previous position of the one nature, and in fact, he completely changed it over to a Nestorian belief of two natures, and he completely renounced the Synod of Ephesus and the 12 chapters, or he basically didn't want to dwell on the Synod of Ephesus. And then people liken Nestorius to Paul of Samosata, and according to some scholars, the Ibas was, I guess, not actually even attributing it, sorry, my apologies, to him, and kind of mocking that comparison. As you can see, Herman Diepen does say, and in this respect, there was first of all the famous letter of the year 433 to Maurice the Persian, the beginning and end of all the violent disputes that arose around Ibas. We have already cited a part of it, where the events of 431 are recounted through the eyes of a genuine Nestorian. Not only does Ibas mock the comparison of Nestorius with Paul of Samosata, in which the concern of Catholics was expressed, but he compares Cyril and the Council of Ephesus to Apollinarius and his Monophysite doctrine. The narrative continues in the same manner, and after venting his hostility towards the Patriarch of Alexandria, Ibas, still only a priest, turns upon his own bishop, Rabula of Edessa, a truly crushing document for Ibas, clear proof of his Nestorianism even after the Peace of 433, of which he claims to be a supporter. So as you can see, And I think this is the scholarly consensus. And even just intuitively, you can read the text and you can see it's absolutely Nestorian without a doubt. The text is completely Nestorian, and there's so many problems with it as listed in the previous slide. There's 6 problems, I guess, that are glaring issues. What I wanted to do is I wanted to give sort of a timeline upon the events for Ibas, just so we do know the events leading up to that and his subsequent deposition, condemnation, and reinstatement. So we start off with the Counter Synod in Ephesus 431, which Ibas talks about. So he only attends that as a presbyter. So Rabula brings him along, he attends as a presbyter, then he attends the Counter Synod. Now in 433, Ibas authors the letter to Marie the Persian. I know some scholars believe it was in 434. The majority views that it was straight after the reunion in the same year. He authors his letter to Marie the Persian, and explains his understanding, which was, as we saw with Herman Diepen, through the eyes of a genuine Nestorian. And then he replaces Rabula of Edessa in 435 and becomes the Bishop of Edessa. Now, we don't hear anything for about 3 years. Then what starts to happen is Proclus of Constantinople is dealing with people from the Orients, and even in Constantinople, with documents that are conveying Nestorian belief. Despite them condemning Nestorius, they still believe in the theology of him, and they were spreading it around through Theodore of Mopsuestia's work. And Proclus explicitly to John of Antioch notes Ibas as the main instigator or promulgator of that. And he never refuses to, or he always refuses to condemn his work. We fast forward, we hear nothing about Ibas for the next 4 years. Then it comes in 442. There's accusations of heresy by people a part of his clergy, so by Cyrus and Eulogius, and they come with a signed petition of 17 clergy members from Edessa, and it's presented to Dominus of Antioch when he visits Hierapolis, Bambius, for the when they had Bishop Stephan in Hierapolis as the enthroned bishop, I guess, in 445. So they bring those accusations there. It's essentially pushed back multiple times. So we actually don't really have any writings from that period itself. We only have writings from later in 448 or 447 that talk about these events. So the accusations come as early as 442. They're only presented at 445, then they're pushed all the way back to 447 or 448. So the next thing we hear about Ibas is Dominus doesn't even really acknowledge the accusations. Ibas is just summoned to a council to review Athanasius of Pera, who's I believe he was judged in maybe session 12 or 13 of the Council of Chalcedon, and he writes to Dominus that he couldn't attend. But a formal inquiry upon the accusations of Cyrus and Eulogius only occur in 447 at a synod of Antioch. And it's dismissed because two of those accusers, so there was 4 in total, two of those accusers went to Constantinople. Now, just a bit of backstory about this. Ibas initially had them excommunicated for going to Hierapolis during the enthronization of Bishop Stephan of Hierapolis. He had them excommunicated. Theodore had acted as their benefactor, got Ibas to remove the excommunication and deposition on them, and they were able to then present their claims in front of a synod in Antioch. Then what happened was two of them violated the orders given by Dominus that they were not allowed to leave Antioch, and they had to present their case first to their archbishop or to their patriarchate. They violated that. They violated canon law. Two of them went to Constantinople instead to try and gain the ear of the emperor. Now, when Dominus found out about that, the acts are also recited in the Council of uh, Beirut, as well as it's talked about a bit in the Robber Council. Then what happens is, specifically, the council is called off. The other two that were at the council, they have an excommunication. They go to Constantinople, and then they gain the ear of the emperor, who commissions 3, I guess, judges. We have Photius of Tyre, Euthanasius of Berytus, or Beirut, and Uranius of Hymeria. Now, what happens is, and a lot of people get confused with this, we have three very bad, confused dates amongst whether it be Chalcedon or Ephesus, or the Robber Council. They have a synod in very, very late 448 or the start of January or the start of next year. And what essentially happens is it's initially in Tyre, then a bunch of clerics come from Ibas or from Edessa, the clergy of Ibas, and they come to complain as well. And there's all riots going out in Tyre. So then what happens is they move the council to Beirut in Lebanon. And then the letter of Ibas is accidentally read out in there. However, the council still vindicates him. They still find him innocent. Then what happens is, after they've all dispersed, the accusers go back to the emperor and say, "We're not happy. We're not happy. We didn't get a plausible outcome. We didn't get the outcome that we needed that actually holds this man to the standard of what he was doing." So the the emperor recommissions another council, and this time it's again in Tyre. In Tyre, they all come to an agreement. Ibas is acquitted, and the accusers come into communion with Ibas. Then what happens is months later, or actually rather, as soon as he returns back to Edessa, there's huge riots that are causing or flaming out. And what happens is specifically for 3 days, the governor ignores it, eventually until the damage is so bad that he holds a synod in Edessa. They present their petition, where a numerous amount of people in the city and from his clergy accusing him of this heresy or renewing the charges. Months later, I'm talking maybe 4 or 5 months later, he's not even allowed to attend the robber synod that was called by the emperor, convoked by Emperor Theodosius II, and he's deposed and excommunicated, and then he's moved from prison to prison until Theodosius dies, and then he's released from the prison, and then he is able to make his own petition, and he gets vindicated at the Council of Chalcedon and restored to his see in 451, and then he dies in 457. Now, I'm going to go over the positions that you can take on the letter of Ibas. So the first is the Monophysite position, which is that the letter was accepted with the full malicious intent of accepting the parts that slandered Cyril, accepting the Nestorian theology, accepting all of those different types of bad things within the letter. The second is that the adoption from Emperor Justinian and Pope Vigilius in his second constitutum, which is from Constantinople II, which is that the letter that the legates and Maximus of Antioch actually referred to was the letter from the clergy of Edessa. And we'll get to what that is because I know this is very early. And the third position is that the Roman legates had a poor understanding of the proceedings and thus had the intent to annul what was done by Dioscorus without adequately knowing what they were accepting. So this refers to a sort of language barrier that they had, where they didn't have a proper understanding of Greek since they were not bilingual and they didn't actually really know any sort of Greek. They only knew Latin. This is endorsed by Father Richard Price, Herman Diepen, and a couple of other scholars. It's somewhat plausible. Now, this is my view and the most plausible view I would take, which is Ibas's multiple verdicts attesting to his innocence, his theology and acceptance of the 12 chapters in Ephesus, a tantamount to a complete rejection of the letter, and his vindication was such that the annulment of the decision, rendered the letter as a useless case against him, thereby vindicating his orthodoxy. I believe that's the most plausible, and it's the most supported account, as well as the most well retrieved or most well received, position within modern scholarship and most scholarship over the history of the churches. The fifth is possible. I would not endorse anyone holding to this view. I can show you a couple of proofs that might support it, but I really would wish people not to accept this view. It's that Chalcedonians are actually free to reject the parts of the council under the provision Leo gives for his legates, as well as the subsequent popes like Pelagius II and Gregory the Great, and Pope Boniface IV. Now, the reason it's kind of a peculiar case with this fifth one, when the Henoticon was established around, or just before that as well, around the period of 490 AD to about 510 AD, you had a lot of Chalcedonians doing the reverse order. They were saying, no, the council was just disciplinary. You don't have to hold to the faith, just hold to the discipline of the council. Only problem is they renewed more accusations. Well, the discipline of the council was accepting Theodoret, who's an historian, as well as accepting Ibas, whose letter was also vindicated. So why are we going to accept that? That's what the anti-Chalcedonian polemics were like. So then that view was completely scrapped. This view was adopted by the Latins, not really the Greeks. The Greeks didn't really have any idea about this. Now, I felt it's more fair to start off with the kind of representative of the Monophysite parties in the 6th century on the letter of Ibas. So if you see what they say, this is in Liberatus's Breviarium. The same Theodore the Cappadocian, together with his followers who were studying under the Catholic name of Acephali, which is translated to the headless ones. It was also known as the people who rejected Timothy, or Peter, sorry, and followed Severus but didn't have any leader. That's why they were called the headless ones. With the favor of Theodora Augusta, who was also an anti-Chalcedonian, approached the emperor and suggested that he should not suffer the labor of writing when he could bring all the Acephali, so the Monophysites, to his communion with him in a concise manner. For they, he says, are offended by this in the Synod of Chalcedon, that it has accepted the praises of Theodore, Bishop of Mopsuestia, and that the Epistle of Ibas, which is known by all to be Nestorian, has been declared orthodox by the Synod itself in its judgment. So as you can see, specifically a content of the Epistle of Ibas, the praising of Theodore, Bishop of Mopsuestia, they say was praised by the people at Chalcedon. So once again, the position of Theodore of Cappadocia, which we've seen, we can see that their claim is that the Council of Chalcedon accepted the malicious parts of the letter itself. Now, I think this probably represents the majority of the views of even the anti-Chalcedonian saints in the Oriental Orthodox Church as well. I think this is the view that they take. They believe that the council actually accepted the malicious parts of the letter, the Nestorian parts of the letter. They accepted the whole letter, essentially, proved it orthodox. Now, I want to be clear about two claims that they can make. And they're two distinct claims. So the first is a valid claim or a valid statement that I think people can assert. So it's that the council accepted the letter, and this is essentially representing this view of Theodore of Cappadocia. The council accepted the letter with the condition that they accepted the malicious intent to affirm the bad parts or the haughty notions of the letter, and this therefore proves that the council is Nestorian. Now you have people then say, reverse this order, and they'll say the council is Nestorian, therefore it accepted the letter. The only problem with this statement is that it's chiasmic or it's anti-metabolic. This essentially means that what people do is they'll inverse a word or phrase and they'll repeat it to preserve the truth value and meaning of the anterior sentence. So the anterior sentence is the first statement. Now let's take this down. So the second statement has taken the consequent, which is it proves the council is Nestorian at the conclusion. It's taken the consequent as its antecedent, and then it's taken the antecedent in the first statement as its consequent. Now that's obviously impossible and also leads just to a circular argument. So you cannot assert this position. So the first statement is valid. The second one is question begging and presumes the conclusion of the first statement. So the first statement has to be asserted. Now, given that we've gotten over this hurdle, we can accept the antecedent, we can deny the justification that they try and prove, and therefore we can deny the consequent. Because if you deny what is anterior to the consequent, i.e., the justification, then we have valid ground to deny the consequent. Now, we're going to go over the history, the main history. This starts in 448, which is with the Council of Beirut or Berytus. Remember as well, it initially started in Tyre, didn't really last there for long because it had to be moved because there was all riots in Tyre. And by the way, Tyre is also in Lebanon, just so we're clear. Anyways, northern Lebanon. Anyways, so the point is this, right? So we're going to start off with the Council of Beirut. And there is a position, I just wanted to lay out all of the positions that we can take. There is a position that starts off with Cardinal Baronius, which is noted in Tillemont's work. Now, he says, They reproached him especially with the ordination of Daniel his nephew, whom he had made bishop of Care, perhaps after the death of Saint Abraham mentioned by Theodora, and Daniel, they said, dishonored that sacred rank by the most scandalous disorders. It was also claimed that Ibas treated with great violence and fury those who would not submit to his will, in order by cruelty to prevent his being convicted of his other faults. Now keep in mind, this is mentioned within the Acts of Chalcedon, session 10. The deacon Theophilus, who spoke against him at Chalcedon, complained of the violence he made the city of Edessa suffer. Now this is what Baronius says. Such were the principal crimes of which he was accused, which Baronius believes to be mere calumnies, because of the quality of the accusers, who were not afraid to attack even the innocence of Theodora, their benefactor. What is certain is that nothing was proved at the council. Now, the reason why I felt I wanted to include this is because it's actually quite important. You need to know the character of the people that are even making the claims. And thus, one can say that it may be more plausible to believe in the accusation or not. If we list out all of what they've done, it doesn't look like a good case for them. They violated canon law, they disregarded the instructions of their archbishop and bishop, and went to Constantinople against their instructions after being reinstated, and were subsequently excommunicated again. And not only that, they got their archbishop excommunicated for a claim that he was a secret Nestorian and he disregarded everything. The only problem is that's impossible, because when they tried to present their petition, they couldn't, because two of them weren't even there, and he immediately cut off the council. And that's literally noted by every single scholar, that the Council of Antioch barely could even continue. You can read Telemont as well. The second is, the accusers praised Theodoret in 447 or 448 for getting them reinstated, and also wished for him to be a judge at the council in Antioch. Then 2 years later, they accused him of heresy and claimed he sat at the council and conspired against them despite him never attending. And that's what Cardinal Baronius mentions here when he says they were not afraid to attack even the innocence of Theodoret, their benefactor. Now, obviously, this brings a couple of problems. It's a bit weird that they want Theodora as the person who's sitting in on the council. They praised him because he was the one that actually got them excommunicated, told Ibas to unexcommunicate them. And I guess it's quite a calumny that they're now turning on him in Ephesus too, or the Robert Council. And the third one is they signed off on the proceedings at Tyre that Ibas was Orthodox and that they needed to treat him as their father. And when they immediately got home, they violated this. Number 4, they conspired with a biased bishop during the proceedings of Ibas, and that same bishop was eventually dropped and not allowed to continue. And 5th, some of the accusers at the Synod of Beirut were accused of assaulting a presbyter or cleric. Now, I'm not going to use any of this. You guys can throw this out the window and disregard this, because I don't feel like it's fair just completely throwing away the actual claims of the accusers. So ignore this whole part. I just wanted to show this as a scholarly view that some people take, which was mentioned by Cardinal Baronius, who is obviously a Roman Catholic cardinal, but then it was also mentioned by famous historian Telemont. Now, in terms of the judges at Berytus, you had 3. Photius of Tyre, who replaced the Nestorian bishop of Tyre, which was Irenaeus of Tyre. You have Eusenacius of Beirut, and you also have Uranius of Hymeria. Now, Uranius of Hymeria, we will see, completely conspired against Ibas under his own claims, but even by the survey of history itself that proves this. So let's read what Robert Sells has to say. Nor can it be doubted that, like his predecessor, the new bishop acted tyrannically, talking about Ibas. The consequence was that his opponents turned for help to the capital, and thither went Uranius of Hymeria to gain the sympathy of the Archimandrite Eutyches and the Alexandrian party of the court. To the capital also came Uranius, the leader of the cabal. Through the power of Eutyches at the court, he and the rest were able to gain the ear of the emperor, and by a decree dated 26th of October 448. Now, of course, as you can see below, it says they were heard by a tribunal with Uranius himself. And as you'll see as well, Claudia Ramelt notes that it's far from impossible that Uranius, in seeking the favor of Eutyches, considered it his duty to contribute to the spread and consolidation of the Monophysite position. And so now the Edessans, encouraged by Urania, sought justice in Constantinople rather than awaiting the synodal verdict at Antioch. And Claudia notes as well that Dalmatius stirred the Edessans in 438 as well. So it's nothing new. These people quite stirred people as well. And you'll see more scholars, George Bevan. When Dominus, this is a pretty important point as well. When Dominus assembled his council, he specifically said, oh, sorry, actually, this is Fleury. Sorry, the name is incorrect. My apologies. This is in his ecclesiastical history, 265, page 265. Uranius of Hymeria was present at the council at Antioch. Now, after the two accusers at Antioch were condemned or excommunicated, he followed them to Constantinople to also present the petition against Ibas. And then he was made the judge of the case. And we're going to see as well, obviously, it might not seem much throwing these things out here, but we're going to see what this actually means later. And of course, Adamar de Alas also says the same thing. Now, even admitted in the Synod of Berytus as well, Samuel, the accuser, says that the Bishop Uranius of Hymeria was also present at Constantinople with them when they presented the petition. And as you can see in the footnote with Richard Price saying, during the initial hearing of the case at Antioch, the plaintiffs appealed to the court of Constantinople. Uranius of Hymeria, near Edessa, followed them there, doubtless to give them support against Ibas. Now, if you take this logic into mind, the accuser's witnesses at Beirutus, they were denied because they were part of the accuser's witnesses that they were going to bring forward were denied as witnesses, valid witnesses, because they were associates of the accusers. Now imagine that this person that attended a council that was supposed to act like a judge went with two excommunicated people over to Constantinople against the advice of, once again, the Patriarchate. And then he also, as an associate, contributed to the inquiry and supported their accusations against the boss. So why is this person being admitted as a judge? And we're going to see later what happens with him as a judge. Now, as you can see at the Synod of Beirut, Photius says this in session 10 of Chalcedon. When subsequently he swore that he had said nothing, referring to Ibas, we took the opportunity to reconcile both parties and restore communion between them. So this is an admission. At Beirut, at the Council of Beirut, they restored communion with the parties and he was acquitted on all charges. So that's the first council that has acquitted Ibas of any charge whatsoever, and the people, the accusers that participated in the council, also accepted communion with Ibas, despite the letter of Ibas to Mari being presented there, and as well as the 17 or 18 accusations being presented against him. Photius goes on to say, the Lord Deacon Eulogius from Constantinople was also, I think, present. We made them friends. The most magnificent official said, so was the most devout Ibas proved guilty by those who accused him? Photius, the most devout bishop, said, no. So we made them friends. He and the presbyters received the holy gifts upstairs in the episcopal palace in communion with each other. After the Synod of Beirut, which is the first synod that was inquiring into Ibas's orthodoxy and the claims that they made against him, he was not found guilty of any charge, despite the letter of Ibas to Marie being at that council, and his accusers even came into communion with him, despite them presenting that letter. Now, as you'll see, we'll go into that a bit more, because that does have more of a premise in the Council of Tyre and the Robber Council, but to further on the position, Claudia Ramelt, just upon the position, of course, that we're going, that he was vindicated, Claudia Ramelt points out that Photius and Euthanasius affirmed, unlike at Ephesus, the investigations conducted at Tyre and Beirut. There, the orthodoxy and integrity of the Bishop of Edessa had been confirmed, so that no further discussion was necessary and nothing stood in the way of his acquittal. The disparity in the atmosphere and aims between the two councils, so Chalcedon and the Robber Synod, becomes evident in the differing attitudes of the bishops. The ecclesiastical dignitaries shifted sides to their own advantage and demonstrated a certain doctrinal instability. While the commissioners at Beirut and Tyre had declared at the Council of Ephesus in 449 that they had refrained from communion with Ibas since the debates in the Phoenician province, we'll get to that as well, two of them now affirm the opposite at Chalcedon. These bishops are not the only examples of doctrinal inconsistency. Such doctrinal inconsistency among the bishops casts the decisions of the imperial synods into doubt. So, not just Chalcedon, but also Ephesus, and also Tyre, and also Beirut. This is a main problem that kept happening at that time. People were just flip flopping back and forth and back and forth. And quite frankly, I don't think that's the best behavior from especially people that were bishops. And I also wanted to point out another point. The person Uranius of Hymeria, he was at Beirut, he wasn't dropped by then, and he acquitted Ibas as well. And we're going to see how they turned on each other, or how they turned on Ibas at the Robber Synod, due to political reasons and the subsequent events that occurred. Now, Robert Sellers also notes that perhaps this might have been used as a way that was more convincing to the judges of the Synod of Beirut. But obviously, the accusers at Beirut didn't accept this at all. They claimed that he had um, forced them to sign this letter. So we have something called the letter from the clergy of Edessa. So I'll present that after. And Robert Sellers says this. He then pleaded that the document drawn up by the clergy of Edessa in his favor should be read. His opponents, however, were not to be so easily overcome. And when ready to hear what they had to say on their side, the commissioners requested that it should be proved that he had called Cyril a heretic. The ad mariam was brought forward and read, yet the accused won his way, in that afterwards the tribunal heard the reading of the Instructio et Deprecatio of the Edessan clergy, so the clergy of Edessa, in which they declared that the bishop upheld the Catholic faith. At this point, it seems the inquiry at Beirut ended, but when the commissioners moved to Tyre, they became mediators of peace. Ibas presented a written declaration concerning his faith, and this satisfied them. Okay, so just remember, Robert Sellers is specifically narrating here that they presented, most likely, the letter of Ibas to Mari. Then Ibas presented his clergy of Edessa letter, which is about 65 signatures of his clergy stating that they're liable to hell if they're lying about their statement right now, and that their bishop is Orthodox and he has never believed anything contrary to the Catholic faith. That's important. And as you can see, Ibas, right before they read out the letter to Mari, kind of foreshadows that he's going to read it. As he says, he, most religious Bishop Ibas, said, our clergy number just over 200 or even more. I don't remember the number. All the clerics have testified whether I am a heretic or orthodox in written depositions that were sent to the most holy Archbishop Dominus. They also wrote to your religiousness. Now, George Bevan also notes that these sequence of events did also occur where they presented the Ad Mariam, which is the letter of Ibas to Mari, and then in response, Ibas presented his letter from the clergy of Edessa. Okay, now here's the kind of pinnacle, and we will slowly go into how we're matching up all of these things. I want everyone just to take a note of the arguments that Ibas and the council starts to use against these accusers. So they make an accusation that Ibas said something quite Nestorian to him. And he then makes the point that, hold on, we had a private conversation and I said to you, but in your case, when you said the life died, did I not at once say to you, friend, if you mean that the flesh of the Lord is life giving and that Christ is our life, I too acknowledge it. But if you allude to the Godhead, I do not accept it. Did you not remain in communion with me for 10 years after that? So the point in which he's trying to make here is that the accusations that they're asserting after the fact, of which they had no problem with it for 10 years. They're just pulling these things out now to accuse him. That's what he's arguing. I'm not arguing that, but it's going to become apparent why this matters. So we go on to Tilmon as well, and specifically his choice. He speaks of the choice of the, as I said beforehand, the choice of the judges, Eusenacius of Beirut, Photius of Tyre, as well as Uranius of Hymeria. Now, he also confirms that it's most likely that the judges chosen were undoubtedly more favorable to the accusers, the ones accusing Ibas, than also than Ibas himself. And he does this by saying that Eusenacius is a distinguished Miaphysite, and that Uranius was also someone who conspired against him, went up to Constantinople um, without him, or to also support his accusers and whatnot. Now, obviously, this is important once again because we need to examine the character of specifically the accusers as well as the judges. It really matters what the judges, their and their character is, because obviously those people make the final decisions whether or not it's valid to acquit him or to depose him and excommunicate him. And even so, even with these favorable judges, Ibas still was pronounced orthodox at the Synod of Beirut. Now, as George Bevan says, he was also exonerated, and now I wanted to get to one of the points about, I believe it was the second point, the second position on Ibas's letter, which is the one that Justinian and Vigilius adopted. And the reason why I have it under the Synod of Beirut is because they mainly used arguments from this synod to ostensibly prove that he didn't write the letter. Now, Robert Sellers does a really good job in simplifying this and making it concise. So he says, we should also note that Justinian speaks of the Ad Mariam, which obviously is the letter of Ibas to Mari, as the letter which Ibas is said to have written, and argues that the bishop never acknowledged it as his own. So that's the first. He never acknowledged the letter as his own. He never came out and said it as his own. And he believes, or Vigilius actually believes, Vigilius said this himself in his second Constitutum, the claims that the second Robber Council, or the second Synod of Ephesus, quote unquote, those claims were obviously a lie. That's what Vigilius says. Not saying I believe that, but Vigilius says that they're obviously a lie when they claim that. We don't have any proof of that in the Acts of Chalcedon. Why didn't the accusers say it? The second is, at Beirut, Ibas said that after the reunion in 433, he had not written anything against Cyril. However, the letter was obviously after the reunion. The letter of Ibas to Murray, that was obviously after the reunion. So, therefore, he denied that he was the author implicitly, or explicitly, I guess they'd say. The third point is that at Chalcedon, he never professed that the letter was his, and that the supporters of the teaching of the Mopsuestian was saying that the letter should not be rejected, since it was to be found in certain copies of the Acts of Chalcedon, but it did not appear as the work of Ibas in the authentic copies to which the bishops had appended their signature. So this is a more complex point. Um, Going into this very briefly, there is a corruption of the Acts specifically around session 10 of Chalcedon. And it's mostly in the Greek acts. I have to say the Greek acts are far more worse than the Latin acts itself, and that comes at the time of the recension for the three chapters. Now, Edward Schwartz initially believed that in the acts when Ibas, or the acts of Beirut, Ibas actually explicitly said that the letter is mine, and then they rescinded it and doctored it so it no longer said that. He later retracted that position towards the end of his life, but there's still another concern, which is that within the Synod of Beirut, or within at least the after the Synod of Beirut is read out and the letter to Mari is read out and the clergy of Edessa is read out, the letter of the clergy of Edessa, the claims of the Roman legates as well as all of the subsequent bishops that are vindicating Ibas actually said that the letter should not be rejected in certain copies. Once again, Edward Schwartz believed that those were the authentic copies, as well as Facundus. He had, I think, a small portion in Latin that he believed was authentic, that they were actually acknowledging that he had written the letter. Now, In terms of the doctoring of the Acts, that's for definitely another video. It's extremely extensive, definitely for another video on the Second Synod of Constantinople, but that was one of the arguments Justinian gave. And the fifth argument is that who cares about what two of them said? We only care about what the majority of the council voiced, which I guess would be anti-papist. But according to scholars, that's clearly not true. And we're going to see as well, a lot of scholars are quite hostile to the idea of the Fifth Ecumenical Council and the idea of these arguments. It's very logical, I guess you could say. The only problem is that it misses a crucial point that either Ibas could have been lying in the case that he said that he had never written anything against Cyril after 433, lending too much credence to Ibas because he could have lied about that, which is what most scholars believe. You can also refer to Henry Chadwick, um, and you can also see that in Vigilius's justification for the, I believe it was the point where it says two, but it was the third point for us, that Chalcedon, he had not professed that the letter was his. That point specifically, according to Vigilius, is a argument that we can make because the synod, the robber synod, was lying when they said that he had claimed that the letter was his. They were just straight up lying. And obviously that's quite a bold claim. Now, we're going to skip past this. So that's the second point just covered. I personally don't necessarily support this view extensively. I might be obligated to hold forms of it or in partiality for my fifth council. But that's for another video. I don't want people critiquing me based upon 530 in light of 533. Oh, sorry, 553 or the Second Synod of Constantinople. That's irrelevant. We're focused what happened in the 5th century. Now, let's present the clergy of Edessa letter. So it says, "We were armed at what was alleged, for what they said far beyond anything ever heard from atheists, unbelievers, heretics, Jews, or heathen. We acknowledge ourselves accursed and subject to the pains of hell. If ever we knew of anything like this being said by him, or anything else contrary to the Catholic faith, and we beg, this is our request, may be inserted in the minutes in the presence of your wisdoms, that there be no lack of publicity." This was in the Synod of Beirut, the Acts of Beirut. This was presented in the Acts of Beirut. They're saying that they're liable to hellfire if they're lying, and that everything he says is not contrary to the Catholic faith or isn't unorthodox. And this is proposed by scholars like George Bevan, Fleury, Robert Sellers, and Claudia Ramalt, that this letter of the clergy of Edessa, the one that we have up here, was read straight after in response by Ibas, foreshadowing it right before they read out the letter of Marie, or Ibas to Marie. Now we'll see right here, Ibas then later kind of says, "Oh no, I never wrote anything." You'll see, as previously stated in the part about Justinian, he says initially he never wrote anything against Cyril after the reunion. Obviously, the letter disproves that. So either he's lying or he didn't write the letter. That's the dichotomous position. I'll leave it up for you guys to accept. I'm just going to say that most scholars believe that he was probably lying. He was probably lying, and that he really authored the letter. Okay, that synod is gone. So just to summarize, this synod in Beirut found Ibas innocent, completely acquitted him of any charge, despite that letter, that incriminating letter being read out, and he was put into communion with his accusers. It doesn't even last a month. We get to something called the Council of Tyre. So remember, initially, don't get this confused. The council, early 449, held in Tyre, riots had to move to Beirut. Beirut synod finishes, Ibas is innocent. They go back to maybe, I don't know, a couple of weeks after, they go back to the emperor, the accusers. They say, "We're not satisfied. We need to do something again." Then what happens is the emperor recommissions the judges. He says, "Get back over there. You need to put them back into communion." And it works. In the ninth session of Chalcedon, we have the final declaration. which is said as this: the aforesaid most God-beloved man, Ibas, undertook even beyond the call of duty to address the church in his own city and publicly anathematize Nestorius, the fomenter of wicked impiety, and those who shared his beliefs and cited his words or writings. He also undertook to profess belief in what is contained in the letter of accord between the most God-beloved and sacred in memory bishops, John of the very great city of Antioch and Cyril of the very great city of Alexandria. And then he says, to assent to all the recent transactions of the Holy Synod that met in imperial and Christ-loving Constantinople. I believe that's referring to the Synod of Constantinople 448, and to embrace everything that was decreed in the metropolis of Ephesus, so the Council of Ephesus, as stemming from a council guided by the Holy Spirit, and to consider it equal to the one convoked at Nicaea, acknowledging no difference between them. Now, this is the important part. Look at who signed off. Take a look at who signed off. Samuel the presbyter, I accept the judgment. Eulogius the presbyter, I accept the judgment. Cyrus the presbyter, I accept the judgment. Maras the presbyter, I accept the judgment. All the accusers accept the judgment. So now that we know who signed off on the letter, we can continue. We can look at who specifically was commissioned. The most important part is now that we need to note of is that one of the bishops was dropped. Do you notice? There's only Photius of Tyre and Eusenacius of Berytus. What happened to Uranius of Hymeria? He's gone. Well, let's take a look why. As Edamar de Aulus notes, specifically, the settlement reached on the February 25th, 449 acquitted Ibas on the charge of heresy and set aside the others. Photius and Eusenacius signed this agreement. The third judge, Uranius of Hymeria, seems to have held aloof until the end. And as Richard Price notes, taking into the account the evasive summary of the proceedings by Photius and the evidence in the Syriac Acts of Ephesus II, which confirms the impression that the judges did what they could to hamper the prosecution, it is clear that they concerned to hush up the scandal of a bishop being accused by his clergy rather than to ascertain to the truth. It is significant that Uranius was effectively dropped from the bench of judges, ostensibly because of his ignorance of Greek, but really we may suspect because he was hostile to Ibas. And not only have we presented the previous evidence, where we've presented that Uranius sat in on the Council of Antioch, participated in excommunicating those two accusers and deposing the other two accusers that went to Constantinople, he followed the excommunicated and deposed to Constantinople to present petitions against the Ibas and to support them. He was then established as the judge of the first synod at Beirut. He was then dropped at the second synod in Tyre. And even then, in the synod of Beirut, you can see something even more peculiar. Look at one of the accusers keep appealing to Uranius, asking him, testify to this, Uranius, testify to this, testify to this. And then Uranius says, in his own language, a letter was read in the presence of the patricians, saying, since they were disrupting the council, we declared them excommunicate, but I was present as a judge and cannot act as a witness. That is correct. In the Roman secular court, as well as the church, obviously a judge cannot act as the witness itself. You need individual witnesses. But obviously you can see that there's some indication here that the accusers have an alliance or some sort of reliance on Uranius of Hymeria to be a witness, to testify to all of that things. And you're going to see that in the Robber Synod. Now, this is the most important part that everyone needs to pay attention to. I don't care if you didn't listen to the previous parts. This is the most important part. We're going to go to the Robber Synod of Ephesus, or the Robber Council in Ephesus in 449 AD. We start off with those two judges, the ones that previously acquitted Ibas, Eusenacius of Beirut and Photius of Tyre, the two ones that acquitted him. Now, as you can see, in the Acts of the Second Synod, or the Robber Council, it says, the God-loving bishops, Photius of Tyre and Eusenacius of Berytus, and Uranius of Hymeria, said in reference to Ibas, matters concerning the faith were mooted in our presence, and because witnesses for this case were requisite, and a long space of time would have intervened, we commanded that those who belong to the clerical body of the city of Edessa should affirm on oath upon the Gospels whatever they were cognizant of in reference to the accusations advanced by him Ibas touching the faith to your holiness. Therefore, it appertains to exercise your authority and to decree what seems fit to you. We, however, signify to your holiness that after the trial we conducted, we have not consented, i.e., we refuse to hold communication with Ibas. So, as you can see, their claim is very clear here. Any case about the faith was mooted, and they refused to hold communion with Ibas after the council. But hold on, if we look at what I just presented at Beirut, at Chalcedon, at Tyre, they acquitted him, called him a God beloved man, blessed him, called him the Father. Why would you make someone into communion and leave them as the Bishop of Edessa when you don't yourself hold him in communion after the council? Was it something perhaps that led you after the council to believe that you needed to hold him outside of communion? We'll see. But the main point is, he claims here, or all three of them claim here, that the faith was mooted. They didn't even talk about it, or they didn't even concern themselves with it at Tyre. But as we'll see, one of the accusers specifically says, we discuss not just what had been brought forward in Antioch, which Ibas recited out to them, and had been given by us in writing, but also questions of faith. Also questions of faith. And the point is this, right? Maybe on the previous judges, they might say, oh, well, they presented the faith to us, but it was just mooted because they couldn't prove that with the witnesses. Well, that's the statement you're talking about. You're talking about that statement, I do not envy Christ because I will become God, blah, 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 blah. What about the letter to Mari? Was that not a accusation of Nestorianism? Was that not part of the faith? Did you not investigate that? Did you just acquit him despite that? Wow, okay. Well, let's see what a couple of the scholars say. Henry Wace and Ian Venables. The Council of Ephesus, so notorious for its scandalous violence, which gained for it from Leo the Great, Epistle 95, the title of the gang robbers, opened on August the 3rd, one of its objects was to get rid finally of Ibas. This was the work of the second session held on August 22. Ibas was not cited to appear, being then in prison at Antioch. Before the witnesses were allowed to enter, the three bishops, so these three ones, Photius of Tyre, Eusenacius of Beirut, and Uranius of Hymeria, who had conducted the investigation at Tyre and Beirut, were asked for an account of their proceedings. Instead of declaring the fact that after the examination made, they had acquitted Ibas, they made pitiful excuses as to their inability to try and arrive at the truth from the distance of the place of trial to Edessa, and endeavored to shift the burden by saying that an investigation had subsequently been held at Edessa itself, which had received the approbation of the emperor, and the wisest course for the council would be to inquire what the decision there. This advice was followed. So did you see them deflecting from those two councils? You vindicated Ibas of those two councils, and the accusers also accepted that vindication and remained in communion with him, despite the letter of Mari being read out. And surely it was brought up at the later council, right? Surely it must have been. So two councils was brought up. You still remained in communion with him, and you tried to brush it off, right? And the peculiar thing is, they always say they read out Beirut and Tyre, those proceedings at the council. The letter to Mari was presented individually, and I didn't see it in any of the minutes. Perhaps it wasn't recorded in those minutes, I don't know. But we saw the inquiry of the governor and those petitions, those were read out. The acts weren't read out. Okay, pretty weird, but anyways, now let's take another look. If you see, what they say is, what the accuser says is, Honourable Sam, for what was sought on approaching the merciful emperors, so that the judges be assigned to us. Their names are the God-fearing Photius, Bishop of Tyre, Eusenacius, Bishop of Beirut, and the holy Uranius, Bishop of Hymeria, of whom I made a mention a little earlier. So remember, he made the little mention earlier here, where he also does just contradict what they said when he says that they weren't crying about the faith. Now, look what he says. When the affair was discussed before them in written form, they resolved the certain points as seemed good to them. Records on the affair were kept by them, which we frequently requested that we might publish, I do not know why they did not allow us to make them public. If we are again required to take up the argument and speak before your splendid eminence about the disorder, which still emanates from the city which had suffered over the events, for everyone ought to be grieved. So remember, they're going on like, oh, we're going to have to repeat the whole argument again. We're ready, man. We're ready to take this Ibas guy down. But look what they say beforehand. Those three bishops just kept refusing to basically release the acts. Now, maybe, let's say it was read in the minutes. I'll grant that, whatever. It's perhaps maybe a couple of months after when they saw that the governors or Edessa was going crazy and that they were 100% going to attack him. Maybe they dropped out of communion with him. They refused to then release the acts, and then they were forced at Ephesus too. Why did you not want the acts read out? Why? And it's so clear. As Henry Wason E. Venable says, they made pitiful excuses for their inability to arrive at the truth, which they acquitted Ibas twice at Beirut and Tyre, despite the letter of Mari being read out. Now, it gets even more ridiculous. So we'll note from the scholar who's translating this, Fleming Perry, that, like I said beforehand, Uranius of Hymeria, through the influence and the solicitation probably of the great Eutychian party and by the order of the Roman government, the complaints ecclesiastical and lay had formulated their libels or acts of accusation and presented them to that governor at Edessa, and who had forwarded these documentary acts, preceding them by his formal report. Now, the point is just to show that Uranius of Hymeria had contacts, which Ibas says, but is also supported by the overwhelming evidence and what scholars say, which I have presented beforehand. It shows that these guys were just promulgating their beliefs, using their corruption to go around and connections in the court to promulgate these beliefs, and literally just to attack these people. You didn't even allow the guy to attend the council. You had him imprisoned. You literally had an order from the emperor through your influence, not even allowing him to attend the council. Which canon dictates that? There's an opposite canon of that. There's literally an opposite canon saying if you don't show up 3 times, you'll be deposed. What's the canon that says you aren't allowed to show up, you aren't allowed to defend yourself, and we're just going to depose you? Look what the Robber Synod says now. So they presented the authentic documents, but also in the interest of the faith, which is most likely referring to the Ad Mari. Now, this is very important. Rome knew about the letter of Mari since 448. So they've known about this letter. They've already known about it. And they ask at the ninth session, do we need to make a formal verdict about it? Because we've known about the letter. We've already known about that. The accusers even admit it. The accusers admit that they went to Constantinople and they went to Antioch. They probably presented it to Rome. And it's also recorded in the ninth session. So they already knew about this letter. Now, let's take a further look, and it's just going to become so much worse. Thereby I pray your highness to repress the violence of the people and to put an end to the tumult, which the accusation made against Bishop Ibas in the city of Beirut has occasioned, through which the people have learned that he is no longer orthodox, and that he has uttered a host of blasphemies, and that he committed many acts subversive of the laws and adverse to the Christian faith. I'm sorry, but are we reading like the same acts? Are we reading what the judges said? They literally acquitted him at the council, meaning that any of the claims that they made, specifically those accusers, not only remained in communion with him after and accepted that he was guiltless of those, but none of it was proven. So he was literally acquitted and found orthodox. So I'm not sure how the accusation that were made in Beirut that were dispelled and acquitted, he was acquitted of, then was proof and a testament to that he wasn't orthodox. Now, this is the most peculiar part. Let's take a look. This letter, i.e., so this is straight after they read the letter of Ibas in the Robber Synod. This letter appears in the accusation we have preferred against Ibas, and the accused himself recognized it as his own. So remember what I said beforehand. Vigilius denied when the accusers said this in the council. They said, no, they're lying. They're lying. He couldn't have accused it. But this becomes more incriminating for them because let's read on. The acts of Beirut are witness of it. Those acts were drawn up in the presence of the judges, who were given to us by the grace and order of the emperor. Amongst these judges was the pious Bishop Uranius, who has asserted, and does still assert, that Ibas has acknowledged himself the author of this letter. There are other persons here who were present at Beirut, which it was read. They know that it was written by Ibas. I beg them, therefore, to make their depositions. Let's take a look. Behold the people. Behold all of them going on. We heard him say it. We heard him say that the letter was his. We heard him say, oh, they're conspiring against me, even though the letter is mine. He admitted it. This is the most peculiar case then. At the council, 2 councils, you said that he acknowledged that the letter was himself. Was this the letter he wrote himself? And not only that, if you look at what they say, it says this. He testified and does still testify that this letter was acknowledged by Ibas as his own, referring to Uranius. Then look what one of the deacons says. I was present, and Ibas, or Heba, acknowledged in my presence that this letter was his. He said, so I acknowledge and so I believe till today. So what was this? So at the 2 councils where they read out the letter, you're vindicating the man that said, I believe till today, that letter is mine. I still believe in the same letter. Come for communion with me, guys. So you all remained in communion with him. You accepted the gifts. 2 councils acquitted him. Those 2 judges acquitted him. And despite that, you still signed off on the communion. Look, Maras the presbyter, I accept the judgment. Look what it says right there. Maras the presbyter, I accept the judgment. Look what he says. So I acknowledge and so I believe till today. That's what Ibas supposedly said. Hold on a second. Wait a second, guys. So we have this. He says, this on account of the quarrel that had broken out between them. Certain other articles were discussed orally and also settled, and both parties accept our decisions. Both of you accepted our decisions. And in fact, it explicitly says that Ibas had to treat them as his sons or his clergy members, and they had to treat Ibas as their father. So you're treating the man that you accuse, acknowledged the letter, and also said he believes till today in what he wrote in the letter, i.e., blaspheming Ephesus, blaspheming Cyril, blaspheming one nature, holding to Nestorian beliefs, all of those heresies you believe, blaspheming Rabula of Edessa, praising Theodore, all of those 6 beliefs. He said he believes in them still, and you decide to remain in communion with the guy. Are you kidding me right now? Does that even logically make sense? So, anyways, the point is, I'm not pulling this out of my backside. My own fathers made this argument. Take a look at the 10th session. After the letter of Mari is read out and after the clergy of the letter is read out, behold, Diogenes, the most devout bishop of Cyzicus, says, I judge the verdict pronounced concerning the most God-beloved Ibas by the most God-beloved bishops Photius and Eusenacius to have force, especially since the accusers pressing the case have approved with their own signatures the decision issued and now read before this holy and ecumenical council. So you signed off on 2 councils and agreed to communion with him, despite him supposedly acknowledging the letter and believing in all the blasphemies present. Are you serious right now? Are you being serious right now? Is this a lie or what's going on here? Anyways, we'll look at some more scholarly commentary. So Henry Wason E. Venables, he says, among those who voted for it were Eusenacius and Beretus and Photius of Tyre, who previously acquitted him on the same evidence. Previously acquitted Ibas on the same evidence that they presented at the Robber Synod. The letter to Mari from Ibas, they acquitted him on the same evidence. You accusers also acquitted him on the same evidence and even went into communion with him. Now, the sentence was that he should be deposed from the episcopate and priesthood and deprived even of lay communion and compelled to restore the money of which it was pretended he had robbed the poor. Ibas, twice acquitted, was condemned without being heard or even summoned, and no protest was raised in his favor, even by those who a few months before had given him their suffrage. Anyways, let's take a look at what the translator of the Robber Council says. He says, "It will be easily perceived by the reader that this sentence of the excommunication upon Bishop Ibas was affected. Such was the flagrant perversion of justice, without the accused having the opportunity of answering for himself at the tribunal, or even having a summons appear at it. It was the result of the intrigues and powerful influence of the great Eutychian party, headed by the ecclesiastical triumvirate named at first. At the end of the 10th session of the Great Council at Chalcedon in 451, Bishop Ibas was pronounced, as well as the letter to Maurice, to be orthodox, was declared free from suspicion by having subscribed Leo's tome, and was reinstated in honor and dignity of the episcopate and in the church from which he was so unjustly rejected." Now let's take a look at the timeline, just to summarize everything. You have the Synod of Antioch, the investigation by Photius and Eusenacius, and Tyre, the Council of Tyre and Beirut. They all find Ibas innocent on the investigation of the faith, despite viewing the letter of Marie, and also, as they claim, despite him claiming that the letter was his, and also despite him saying that still to the present day he believes in the contents of the letters. Then at the Robber Synod, ostensibly it records both of those judges saying they didn't investigate the faith, and they found him guilty almost by inference by not holding communion with him. But the Synod's judgment at Tyre and Beirut, appraising Ibas, appraising him for being an orthodox man and a God-beloved man. So the claims do not hold up here. Then at Chalcedon, the judges at those three councils and private investigation relay the same information at those councils and say they found Ibas innocent already despite the letter to Marie and on account of his faith. Is it any more clearer than this? It just seems absolutely absurd. These people specifically said that Ibas admitted to writing the letter and believing to this day what the contents of the letter espoused. Then he was acquitted by two of the councils, and in each of those councils, all five of those accusers, or all four or three or whatever, all said that they remain in communion with him, that they will accept the communion with him, and they just broke it immediately after. Anyways, this is quite sickening, but as you can see as well, they even said, "We also persuaded the aforesaid men," so these men, Maras, who literally said that specifically Ibas said, "So I acknowledge the letter is mine, and so I believe till today." "We also persuaded the aforesaid men themselves to come to the same most God-beloved Bishop Ibas as to a father, and to promise a good will and disposition in all respects, now that with the help of God every unpleasantness had come to an end." Okay, so never heard of an instance where some guy is making an accusation for all of his years, literally admits that he, or literally claims that the guy admitted to all of the heresies and then wants to come into communion with him. Anyways, we're going to get to the Council of Chalcedon now. So I think this is perfectly summarized by Herman Diepen when he says, "Thus the rehabilitation of Ibas was an accomplished fact. Apart from a brief remark by Maximus of Antioch, the legate's judgment concerning the letter to Maurice the Persian passed without comment. Passentius alone had declared it orthodox in his own name and in that of his colleagues. This strange fact constitutes against our thesis on the mentality of the Council of Chalcedon an objection that might be considered serious. It is fitting to examine it with complete objectivity." I completely agree. It's a very, very serious accusation that a lot of anti-Chalcedonians make, and that almost with an intuitive reading might seem quite problematic. And even this scholar, Herman Diepen, and an Eastern Orthodox Archbishop, Peter Holly, I believe, in his work on the Church on the Ancient Councils, I think maybe page 198, they even say the Roman legates acted imprudent, basically blaming them. So let's see what the Roman legates said. In the council, after the letter of Marie is read out, and then subsequently the letter from the clergy of Edessa is read out, They say this: Pescentius and Lucentius, the most devout bishops, and Boniface the presbyter, representing the apostolic see, said through Pescentius, now that the documents have been read, we know from the verdict of the most devout bishops that the most devout Ibas has been proven innocent, and from the reading of his letter, we have found him orthodox. This is the statement that has caused division for 1500 years. So what does it mean? What does that mean? Okay, so we also have the Acts of Chalcedon, where Maximus of Antioch is saying, and from the reading of the transcript of the letter produced by his adversary. Remember, the letter produced by his adversary isn't going to be the letter that is vindicating Ibas. Why would he present that letter? The letter is obviously the letter from specifically the letter of Ibas to Mari. Obviously, the adversary or the person who's against Ibas isn't going to be presenting a letter from the clergy of Edessa that specifically vindicates him. Why would they do that? What's even the point of being at the council to accuse the person if you want to cite a letter that's vindicating him? Anyways, obviously, like that harsh tone might be expressive of anti-Chalcedonians. Once again, guys, don't hold me to it. But anyways, VC Samuel has a decent kind of summarization of this. I find it quite contraposed to Karakin Sarkisian, the Armenian bishop. So he says, in acquitting Ibas, also there were two opinions among the delegates. Whereas the Roman legates and their eastern supporters voted for his exoneration on the ground that the sentence of condemnation passed against him by the Council of 449 had been irresponsibly given. The rest of the assembly agreed to his acquittal because he had already condemned Nestorius and Eutyches. So I agree. I think the Roman legates specifically had the view we need to reverse everything Ephesus 2 did, the Robert Synod did, even including their condemnation of anything, absolutely anything. And he says, here also the decision of the Council of 553 declaring the letter of Ibas to Marie heretical confirmed the sentence not of the Roman legates but of the Council of 449. This is the part I disagree with. That then presumes that obviously the Roman legates are approving of the malicious parts of the text. Obviously, I would never admit that because that would incriminate the council, and thus you could say that Chalcedon and 553 may be achieving the same thing because they never actually approved of the malicious parts of the letter. Now, obviously, that language presumes that I'm saying that they accepted one part of the letter, not saying that that was also condemned. This is contraposed to Karakin Sarkisian. He says explicitly that a further example of the pro-Antiochian sympathy in the Council of Chalcedon was the rehabilitation of Ibas of Edessa in his orthodoxy. He was recognized as orthodox on the basis of his famous letter to Mari, which was read here and approved. Again, it wasn't on the basis of the letter being ostensibly orthodox. It was on the basis that he was acquitted by those two previous councils. And you can see explicitly the legates say, do we need to make a formal verdict after reading it? Or do we need to make a decision based upon the verdict that's already been given, based upon the evidence that's presented to us? And obviously, it's based upon what the evidence presented to them. It was based upon the formal verdict given in Tyre and in Beirut. Well, actually, they didn't read out Beirut, but in Tyre mostly, that they made their decision based upon, not on the letter. The letter was never included a part of their quote unquote decision to vindicate him. This is the most interesting part. So one way that we can kind of understand what the legates actually meant is through some of the subsequent people commenting after the legates, maybe giving more of a context to what they mean. So this specific quote I'm about to present, this is actually omitted in the Greek Acts of the Council of Chalcedon, which was obviously rescinded at the time of Justinian. And it says this: now, indeed, from the documents that have been read, out of the venerable Ibas has been proven guiltless. For as regards the statements in which he was seen to accuse the most blessed Cyril by speaking ill of him, referring to the contents inside of the letter, he made a correct profession in his final statements, i.e., his condemnation of Eutyches, or his statements after the proceedings of Tyre at the end, of him going to anathematize Nestorius, in the church and all of those different commitments he made, and repudiated the charges he had brought forth, as well as saying, therefore, with him anathematizing Nestorius and Eutyches, referring to his final statements, and their impious doctrines, and assenting to what was written by the most holy Archbishop Leo and by this ecumenical synod, I too judge him worthy of the episcopate. Now, some people say the final statements actually refer to what was seen in the letter. This, as you can see by the conjunction of what he's saying, in the conclusion of what Ibas has done to vindicate him or to rescind what he wrote on Cyril, therefore presume orthodox. So then one can lead credence to the position that his previous statements, or he was previously unorthodox, and then his statements essentially nullify those previous statements. What he said in terms of his condemnation of Eutyches, his condemnation of Nestorius, would automatically wipe out all of those points that he was charged with heresy for. He's condemning Nestorius in all of his belief. That takes away the point that he was in the letter where he was mocking the belief that people were accusing Nestorius of being Paul of Samosata. He agreed to, in at least the Council of Beirut, he agreed that he followed everything in Ephesus, as you guys claim, or as some people claim, the 12 chapters were read out at Ephesus. If that's the case, then he accepts that. That's taken off the list of the heretical parts. About the divided sayings, Cyril admitted that, of course, in many of his previous letters, and obviously the statements that he made after of which the letter was read out, or after of which they saw entire, they clearly saw that as a complete vindication and complete renunciation of his previous words, his previous texts. And even Juvenal, look what Juvenal says. He says, the divine scripture orders the receiving back of those who repent, which is why we also receive people from heresy. He believes, like Eunomius, that Ibas, of course, once previously was the heretic due to his letter. However, he's renounced that and he's become orthodox, and therefore he deserves to receive clemency. And this is the exact position that has convinced quite a few scholars, such as William D. Bright. Let's take a look at what he says. The commissioners proposed that certain parts of the records of the Latrocinium, which related to Ibas, should be read, but the legates in the council would not hear of it. They pronounced him orthodox, evidently on the ground that his letter to Mari, which they distinctly took into consideration, was now to be read in connection with his recent language and his acceptance of the term in the definition, to which he added an oral anathema against Nestorius. They must have considered him virtually to retract his censor of the Ephesian council, whose authority they held sacred. Exactly what Eunomius and Juvenal were getting at. Spot on. Completely spot on. And even his clergy, they say he doesn't hold anything against the Catholic faith. If he does, then we're all liable to hell. We're all liable to hell. Now, look at what Adamar de Olive says. He says the meaning of the sentence rendered at Chalcedon was discussed, for some pretended to find in it an approval of the letter to Marie. That claim was evidently false. The Council of Chalcedon had approved the judgment of Photius of Tyre and Eusenacius of Berytus, so contrary to what that Armenian bishop said, who required from Ibas an anathema against Nestorius. Now to anathematize Nestorius or to anathematize the letter to Marie is all one. In reality, Ibas had been reconciled at Chalcedon as a penitent, as required by Juvenal of Jerusalem, Thalassius of Caesarea, John of Sebast, Seleucus of Amasia, Constantine of Melitene, Patrius of Tyana, Peter of Gangra, Artebes of Trebizond, and all the other metropolitans. He had to renounce his past, and of that past, the letter to Marie was a notable part. It is not enough to point out with Eunomius of Nicodemia some parts, orthodox parts in it, or heretical documents contain some orthodox parts. The whole nonetheless remains heretical. Same position that William D. Bright has asserted, that the Acts of Chalcedon also convey. And not only that, but as I said beforehand, if we just go back to the Robber Council, even this position that these people, these accusers adopted, we can just adopt ourselves. They clearly found a way such that they appended their signatures, according to Diogenes of Cygnus, to the decisions read out at Tyre and Berytus, despite the letter of Mari being read, Ibas to Mari being read. So clearly they believed that this was a possible case. Clearly they believed that his claims at Tyre and at Beirut, specifically Tyre, was enough to remain in communion with him, and that he renounced all of his previous works and or previous heresies in the letter of Ibas to Mari. Now, if we continue through the scholarship, I think this is the most accurate way of presenting this by Raphael Pavirus. He says, in any case, in our view, it became clear that Ibas denounced the content of the letter. The only specific references to the letter were made by the papal legates and Maximus of Antioch. In particular, the papal legate said, "Now that his letter has been read, we ascertain that he is orthodox." Similarly, Maximus declared from the reading of the copy of the letter, which was submitted by his Abbas accuser, his faith was proven orthodox. We think that it is evident that the council did not spare time to examine theologically the content of the controversial letter. If it had done, there is no doubt it would have denounced it clearly. So this is a response to all of those people saying, "Oh, but why didn't they come out and denounce it immediately?" Anyways, and it's kind of thinking of it like this: like the legates are saying, given we're reversing everything of what Ephesus did, and given the Synod of Tyre has vindicated them, despite the letter, despite the letter, we can prove him orthodox. Look what he goes on to say. Such a clearly Cyrillian council would have been endorsed as orthodox, a letter that calls Cyril teaching Apollinarian and questions the propriety of the actions of Ephesus 1. Just like Theodora, Ibas was received only so long as he repeatedly anathematized Nestorius and subsequently de facto the contents of the letter to Mari. Yet the question remains, what did the papal legates and Maximus of Antioch mean by saying that Ibas was proven orthodox after the letter was read? If by saying that they agreed that Cyril's 12 anathemas were indeed Apollinarian and that Ephesus 1 was unfair to Nestorius, the papal legates in particular would have been in opposition to their own Christological outlooks and the actions of Pope Sixtus and Pope Celestine, Pope Sixtus, and even Leo, who had praised Cyril and Ephesus 1. Even if this was the case, why did the rest of the council not react against such a clear attack on Cyril? In our view, at least in the case of the papal legates, this means simply that now that this letter has been read and Ibas has denounced its teaching, we can safely say that he is orthodox. So, given the reading, given that that document was used as a proof of heresy, it's now approved as something that can't be used as heresy, cannot be used at all as some claim against him. Therefore, is orthodox. A perfect summation of my position. I completely agree. And to substantiate his views, if you look at what Pope Leo was saying, he was saying in all of his private letters, but what was especially decreed against Nestorius should be retained. Those decisions of the former Council of Ephesus, over which Bishop Cyril of holy memory presided at that time, contradicts that letter, contradicts the part where he criticizes Cyril, all the actions of Cyril at Ephesus, the theology of Ephesus, etc., which we preach in the same spirit as did our holy fathers, condemn as well as prosecutes both Nestorian and the Eutychian perversity together with their authors. Pope St. Leo says as well, there is too a letter from Cyril of holy memory, Bishop of Alexandria, in which he attempts to correct and reform Nestorius. When the new bishop notes that his letter agrees with the views of previous writers, let him also review the proceedings of the Council of Ephesus, the testimony of the Catholic priest concerning the Lord's incarnation against the infidelity of Nestorius was brought forward and inserted in those proceedings by Cyril of holy memory. Take a look at that. Again, Leo says, to bring to the notice of all our brothers the letter which we sent to the East to defend the faith, as well as the letter of Cyril of holy memory, which is in complete agreement with our views. If we're to take that first position, the anti-Chalcedonian view, it's literally impossible. It's absolutely impossible. The fact is, you asserting that claim ends up in a contradiction. The Roman legates must have contradicted themselves and the other bishops hundredfold when they constantly praise Cyril and then supposedly accepting the attacks on Cyril in the letter as well as the Council of Ephesus. In the definition of faith, it literally praises the council, which Ibas then agreed to in the very same session, or approved of it. The second, Leo contradicted himself multiple times where he endorsed the Council of Ephesus and Cyril's work but praised a work condemning all of this. The third, Ibas not only contradicted himself sentence after sentence at Council of Tyre and Council of Beirut, but also at the Council of Chalcedon, and the Roman legates' decisions would have been contraposed to that of Photius and Euthanasius' decision and the decision of Tyre, which all of the bishops said that they were affirming. It'd be completely contraposed. The Roman legates only literally reinstated the guy because of what he said at Tyre, that he'd agreed to everything at Ephesus, he denounced Nestorius, and he gave a pure Orthodox confession of his faith. If those three conditions are completely, utterly contraposed and in contradistinction to the letter presented that they claim is Orthodox, then it's absolutely impossible to even make that assertion. Now, this is one of the positions as well. I believe it was the fifth one. So this was from Herman Diapen. And it's essentially the view that the Latins, and this is actually taken by Richard Price as well. This scholar is cited by a lot of Monophysites like V.C. Samuel, Bishop Saraxian, and Shenouda Ishak. But essentially, Herman Diapen says this: that vote of the Roman legates, together with their judgment, when the letter was read to us, we realized its orthodoxy still remains astonishing. Another explanation would be to suppose that the Roman legates, who spoke Latin and must not have grasped all the nuances of the Greek language, did not understand the sense of the letter. For the men were Latins and ignorant of Greek, and since they did not know the language, they realized the error only late, says Pelagius II, to excuse the tenacious opposition of the West to the Fifth Council. How else can one explain, on the assumption that the text is authentic, that Pesentius declared orthodox the principal assertion of the letter, the very contradiction of the dogma of Ephesus, namely that the Word of God did not himself become man? In an earlier session, Pesentius himself had assured the bishops of Palestine that the tome to Flavian in no way divides Christ into one person and another. After bearing witness to their loyalty to the earlier council, can one believe that the Roman legates would in the 11th session burn what they adored in the 4th? It is sheer implausibility. I completely agree. It's literally impossible. The bishops, we can assert, as noted by Raphael Pavorus and William de Bright, literally took the same agreement that the accusers took at Beirut and as well at Tyre. They all knew about the letter and they still acquitted him, despite the letter being quote unquote orthodox. Now, to the doctrinal contradiction would be added a juridical one. Only a few days before the council had inserted its definition, an explicit mention of the Council of Ephesus of June 22nd, 431, as an ecumenical council venerable like those of Nicaea and Constantinople. And today the Roman legates would declare orthodox the letter that insults this council and formally renounces it. This hypothesis of an error of interpretation will not seem strange to those who to those who know the often fantastical commentaries written on this letter in the 6th century by the defenders of the three chapters, and sometimes also by those who, while condemning them, feared to endure the Council of Chalcedon. It is not even necessary to go so far back in the past to find similar cases of complete misunderstanding of the obvious sense of the letter of Ibas. Richard Price actually endorses this view, and you can see he says this: despite the element of desperation in the attempt under Justinian to. Oh, by the way, actually, I just wanted to give a bit of an explanation. So, what this scholar is essentially saying here is that the legates really only had an interest for the decision at the Synod of Tyre, and they weren't either paying attention or they didn't have a proper understanding of the Greek, because there was actually both of those, or Pesentius and Lucentius, except for Bishop Julian of Cos, um, neither of those legates were bilingual. So that's why he's making this argument. And Richard Price clearly finds it convincing. So look what Richard Price says. He says, despite the element of desperation in the attempt under Justinian to disassociate the letter to Marie from the reinstatement of Ibas, it would be equally tenditious to treat his reinstatement as evidence of sympathy on the part of the Chalcedonian fathers towards the aggressively anti-Cyrillian Christology of Theodore and Ibas. But it was certainly not intended as an expression of approval for their theological teachings, which went against the pro-Cyrillian loyalties of the vast majority of the Council Fathers, as you can see. Loyalties that were expressed in the wording of the Chalcedonian definition, as well as in the lack of enthusiasm with which the bishops received Theodora and Ibas back into the fold. But the Acts of Chalcedon make clear how unacceptable were these writings already in 431, so referring to the letter of Ibas to Mari. And this is also found right before the 10th session. This is just in Richard Price's commentary. If we even go further, Richard Price says that the reason as to why specifically Maximus of Antioch did follow on with that specific statement was because he was just following the Roman legates. And he says that this was an embarrassment at Chalcedon when it was read out, where the bishops, while generally avoiding mention of the controversial document, vied with each other in professing devotion to Cyril's memory and Cyril's teachings. When the bishops came to pronounce judgment on Ibas, two of the most senior Pesentius and Pope Leo's chief representative and Maximus of Antioch actually cited the letter to Mari as evidence of Ibas's orthodoxy, probably as a way of ensuring that no other bishop speaking after them would be free to complicate the discussion by raising it as a problem. Another hypothesis thrown out by him. Now, I just wanted to be clear about one of the things that might be brought up. So, some people might bring up the fact that maybe after the Synod of Beirut, maybe the reason why the judges and the subsequent, specifically the subsequent, the accusers, maybe the reason why they broke out of communion and they disobeyed that was because after the proceedings in Beirut, and why everyone in Edessa went crazy. As soon as Ibas arrived home in Edessa, everyone condemned him. And the accusers must have hopped back on that train because they still wanted the guy out. And then the judges must have seen that. They must have seen, well, he's gone now. And we would be screwed if our decision was seen as something that is the final acquittal of him. And the reason as to why is because they must have found out about the letter of Ibas when it was read at the Synod of Beirut. The only problem is, first, the Synod of Tyre is after that, meaning that they still accepted communion despite the letter being read and despite them breaking communion the first time. And look, they said now that they approached Arius to ask that Heber be deposed, what had intervened? The clergy recognized that there had been rumors about mishandling finances, but these had not caused them to want to depose Heber. What had made them change their mind was Heber's letter to Mari. That's the thing about faith that was so concerning to these people in Edessa. And as the Acts say, thereby I pray your highness to repress the violence of the people and to put an end to which the tumult which the accusation which made against Bishop Ibas in the city of Beirut has occasioned, through which the people have learned that he is no longer orthodox, that he has uttered a host of blasphemies. So I guess this view might have credence, perhaps. And then Shenouda Ishak adds on from his commentary in Edward Schwartz that this gave the bishops who spoke next the courage to say that he should be reinstated on the more judicious grounds that his judges at Tyre had not deposed him and he had anathematized Nestorius. No one asked whether he in fact carried out his promise at Tyre to anathematize Nestorius and declare his acceptance of the full authority of the Council of Ephesus of 431, which he had derided in his letter to Mari, since he had been unable to return to Edessa after the hearings at Beirut, and Tyre. We can only suppose that he had not done so. So first of all, I'm not too sure if that chronological account is correct, because after Beirut, he was unable to return. But even after Tyre as well, he was unable to return. So let's say we grant that. The problem still remains. Those people, under the interpretation that I gave, that William D. Bright gave, that Raphael Pavoris gave, and that a numerous amount of scholars gave, like Ademir de Arles, as well as even a person in the council of Chalcedon, Diogenes of Cyzicus, they even say, why did the accusers append their signatures to communion despite the letter of Ibas being read out? That's still one of the things that puzzles these people and then leads them to say that his statements subsequent in Tyre and as well in the Council of Chalcedon, accepting the definition of faith, accepting the term of Leo, denouncing Nestorius, accepting everything decreed in Ephesus and Ephesus itself, is a virtual retraction of everything within the letter and is tantamount to proving the letter not to be used against him as a heresy, but as a testament to his orthodoxy, since he's renounced everything in the letter itself. So even if we were to grant this, let's say they all found out about the letter, and that's how they specifically broke communion. What about those accusers? What about the people at the council that promulgated these accusations? Now, Richard Price and Michael Whitby do go over this. They say, in view of this letter, and this is also Herman Diepen's position, in view of this letter's disrespectful treatment of Cyril and Ephesus, and curiously muted criticisms on the stories, these compliments seem oddly injudicious. Sorry, guys. One wonders whether Pesentius had really taken in the full contents of the letter. He was not a native Greek speaker, and one may suspect that by the end of the reading of the Acts of Beirut, he was not listening very carefully, and as a Westerner, he may in any case have been less than sensitive to the way in which the letter was acutely embarrassing to the Eastern bishops, who recognized that Ibas had to be restored to his see, but were hugely respectful of Cyril and Ephesus. But once Pesentius, as the senior bishop present, had uttered his verdict, it was contrary to conciliar etiquette for anyone to question it. Maximus of Antioch, like the other bishops, could simply have ignored the letter when it came to his turn to speak, but his tenure of the see of Antioch, to which Dominus's superior rights had not yet been discounted, depended on the Roman support, and he chose to echo Pesentius. So that view that he's asserting right there is Herman Diepen's view, that they were ignorant, they weren't listening, they didn't really know Greek that much. That's opposed by this scholar, Istefan Kupon, who I have talked about a bit before, and I have used him for Theodoret specifically. He says this: the manner of his rehabilitation at Chalcedon became a source of continuous debates, both ancient and modern. From the records of the council as well as from other contemporary subsequent documents, it is clear that Ibas was rehabilitated not only despite what he had written to Maurice, but indeed based on his epistle, which is obviously a position that I denied and that was subsequently vindicated or previously vindicated. You'll have to scroll back in the video for that. Anyways, the verdict of Rome asserted by Bishop Pesentius and Chalcedon was in this sense unambiguous, to which adhered not only Anatolius of Constantinople, but also Maximus of Antioch. The latter specifically exonerated Ibas from every charge of heresy and named him orthodox based upon what he had written. Diepen's suggestion that Pesentius commended the letter to Marie only because he did not understand it is not supported by the records and minutes, which show that the Roman delegates were very much acquainted with the nuances of the debate, including the fine distinction between out of the two natures and in two natures. I'm not too sure where Esteban's getting this from, but specifically um, the legates in maybe session 5, I don't see any nuances that they had. Reading the text and seeing the difference between out of two and in two natures, or following what Leo says, is not really much of a nuance that would then be against Herman Diepen's position. In fact, Herman Diepen says that the legates were sent without preparation to the east to preside over a gathering of Greeks, and it is known that Leo had chosen Pesentius simply because the Sicilian bishop could more easily leave his flock than the bishops of the Italian regions already invaded by the barbarians. So not that this guy was some theological expert, he already knew, he was already sent without any sort of preparation. So not too sure where Estevan's getting this whole thing, and especially with this idea that they knew the nuances of the difference between out of two natures and in two natures, when specifically that was the condemned part that Leo kept saying in his tome, letter 36 or 34, each time. It wouldn't take a genius to figure out that one person is saying out of two and the other is saying into. Anyways, the last position that I'm going to present is that on a technicality, maybe one might be able to. I definitely do not endorse this position. I recommend no one holding to this position. I just thought it'd be a fun thought experiment. So it's the idea that someone might actually be inclined to reject any disciplinary sessions that were beyond the definition of faith. As Leo says in letter 119, in fact, if those brothers whom I sent to represent me at the Holy Council, so Pesentius and Lucentius, are shown to have done what was out of keeping with the cause of the faith, it will have absolutely no validity. No validity. So one could then say, oh, okay, well, you've indicated Ibas, so that has no validity. But obviously, anyways, going upon that, whatever is brought in for the examination of the bishops that is in addition to the special problems for which the meetings of the council are held can be passed on by them with some justification, but only if nothing was decided about it by the Holy Fathers at Nicaea. It will never be possible to get the consent of the Apostolic See for anything not in harmony with their arrangements and decrees. And then subsequent to that, Pope Pelagius does give a kind of explication of that, where he says, for the private cases dealt with there, after the definition of faith, not only did he in no way confirm them, but he allowed them to be reconsidered and judged anew. And likewise, Pope Gregory the Great says, the Holy Synod of Chalcedon, up to the definition of faith and the promulgation of the canons, dealt with matters of general concern. For after the promulgation of the canons, it took care to settle the particular contests of the bishops. As for the letter, which in the Synod the most reverend Ibas denies to be his, since it lies in the final part of the Synod, you recognize it. In that letter, namely, he asserts, and I'm not just going to read the whole thing, let's go to the bottom. Therefore, the letter which defends the one condemned by the Synod and accuses the one venerated by the Synod is without a doubt shown to be opposed to the definition of the Holy Synod. And lastly, Herman Diepen gives us a bit of an explication, an answer to those who are saying, oh, well, this is quite anachronistic. He says this, today this distinction is readily dismissed out of hand. People say it was invented for the needs of the case. So people say it was invented just so you can be a good little Chalcedonian and obviously defend your little legates or whatever. This is to forget not only that from the very beginning of the quarrels over the 3 chapters, the Catholics already made it, but above all that it rests on the formal and express texts of St. Leo. It is not only Canon 28 which the Pope accepted from his approval, he annulled by his sovereign authority that decision about the prerogatives of the Patriarch of Constantinople. He did not annul others, but he left as they were reformable judgments all the sentences of the council concerning private causes or particular cases. For thus he wrote on March 21st, 451, to the fathers of Chalcedon, let the brotherly assembly and all the hearts of the faithful know that I have united my judgment with yours, not only through the brothers who executed my office, but also by my own approval of the synodal acts, namely in the cause of faith alone, a point which must often be repeated, on account of which it was pleasing that a general council be assembled, both by command of the Christian princes and with the consent of the Apostolic See, so that the heretics who were unwilling to be corrected, having been condemned, no doubt at all might remain concerning the true incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ. So I guess fun experiment, I guess one could say, maybe someone has a grounds to reject the council, or those sessions, sorry, not the council. But yeah, I don't hold to that view at all, and I would recommend that no one else holds to it. Okay, well that's it. This was a long video. I talked for a lot, so hopefully it wasn't too boring for you guys, and I'll see you later in the next video.